The truth behind this 1898 family photo is more tragic than anyone imagined. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the conservation lab on Newbury Street, casting shifting shadows across Sarah Mitchell's workbench. At 34, she had restored hundreds of photographs, daguerreotypes from the Civil War era, faded tintypes of immigrant families, crumbling albumin prints that smelled of time itself. But the photograph that arrived that Tuesday morning in October felt different. The image showed a family of 5 posed in what appeared to be a photographer's studio. The year 1889 was penciled on the back in faded graphite. A bearded man in a dark suit stood behind a seated woman whose elaborate dress suggested modest prosperity. 3 children arranged themselves around their parents. 2 boys in matching sailor collars flanking their mother, and a girl of perhaps 14 standing beside her father. Sarah adjusted the magnifying lamp, studying the composition. Victorian family portraits followed predictable patterns. Rigid postures, unsmiling faces, the formal distance that characterized an era when photography still felt like capturing one's soul. Yet something about this particular arrangement nagged at her professional instincts. The father's right hand rested on his daughter's shoulder, but the placement seemed deliberate beyond mere affection. His fingers weren't simply touching her dress, they pressed into the fabric with visible intention, each digit positioned with what looked like careful purpose. The daughter's face showed the faintest tension around her eyes, a tightness in her jaw that suggested she was holding something back. She photographed the image at high resolution, zooming in on details. The father's expression was stern but not unkind. The mother sat with perfect posture, her hands folded precisely in her lap. But there was something unsettling about her vacant stare. Her eyes seemed to look past the camera rather than at it. The 2 boys showed typical restlessness. One had slightly blurred features, suggesting movement during the exposure. But the daughter remained perfectly still, her body language speaking volumes that Sarah couldn't quite translate. She stood close to her father, almost leaning into him, seeking shelter perhaps. As afternoon light faded, Sarah found herself returning again and again to that hand on the shoulder. Victorian fathers rarely displayed such physical affection in formal portraits. This hand was communicating something specific, intentional. Each finger pressed down in what almost looked like a sequence or pattern, a message waiting to be understood across more than a century of silence. By morning, Sarah had contacted the client who'd submitted the photograph, a woman named Helen Richards, who'd inherited it from her grandmother's estate. Helen knew little about the image beyond a family story that it depicted her great-great-grandparents, but she agreed to meet Sarah at the lab that afternoon. Helen arrived at 2 o'clock, a retired librarian in her late 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes. She studied the photograph with curiosity and sadness. "My grandmother never talked much about this side of the family," she explained. "I found this in a box after she passed. It was wrapped separately, almost hidden." Sarah showed Helen the high-resolution images on her computer screen. "I need to ask something unusual. Do you know if anyone in your family history was deaf or hard of hearing?" Helen's eyes widened. "Actually, yes. My grandmother's mother, she would have been the daughter in this photo. She was deaf from childhood. A fever when she was about 4 or 5. "Why?" Sarah zoomed in on the father's hand. "Because I think your great-great-grandfather is speaking to his daughter in this photograph. Look at the finger placement. It's not random." For the next hour, Sarah explained her theory. During the late 19th century, before American Sign Language became widespread, many families with deaf members developed their own systems of tactile communication, patterns of touches and finger positions that conveyed meaning through touch rather than sight or sound. Helen leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching. "I never knew. Grandmother never mentioned this." Sarah had spent the previous evening researching historical tactile communication methods. The pattern of the father's fingers, thumb pressed down, index finger extended, middle and ring fingers curved, pinky pressed firmly, resembled documented finger spelling positions, but with variations suggesting a family-specific system. "Can you translate what he's saying?" Helen asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Not exactly, but I have a colleague who studies historical deaf education. She might help." Sarah paused. "There's something else." The mother's expression, It's unusual. Most women in formal portraits showed some emotion. She looks completely disconnected. Helen nodded slowly. There was a story, very vague, that someone on that side had been troubled. Mental illness wasn't discussed openly then. Sarah pulled up another magnified section. The mother's hands, clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white even in sepia tones. Beside her, one young son leaned slightly away, his small hand gripping the chair arm as if steadying himself. "Would you let me investigate further?" Sarah asked. "I'd like to trace the family's history, see what records exist." Helen touched the photograph gently. Maybe it's time someone understood why grandmother kept this hidden. The Massachusetts Historical Society occupied a stately building on Boylston Street, its archives holding countless fragments of Boston's past. Sarah approached the research room that Friday morning with particular anticipation. The Society's collection included business records from several 19th century photography studios, including Whitman and Sons. The archivist, Thomas Chen, greeted her warmly. At 53, he'd spent 3 decades helping researchers navigate the collections. Victorian photography studios were surprisingly meticulous, he said, pulling leather-bound ledgers from climate-controlled stacks. Every sitting was recorded: date, time, client name, number of exposures, special requests. Sarah settled at a research table, pulling on cotton gloves before opening the first ledger. The handwriting was cramped but legible, entries organized chronologically. She started with January 1889, scanning each page carefully through spring months filled with mundane yet fascinating entries. Then, in the ledger dated June 1889, she found it. The Harrison family. Father, mother, 3 children. Special arrangement requested. 1 exposure only. Payment in advance. Note: father specified no retouching. Sarah's pulse quickened. She photographed the entry, noting the date, June 15, 1889. The special arrangement notation was unusual. Most families wanted multiple exposures, and retouching was standard practice. Thomas appeared at her shoulder. "Found something?" "The Harrison family. Are there other records, city directories, census records, newspaper archives?" They worked together for 2 hours, piecing together fragments. The 1890 census showed James Harrison, age 42, clerk at a shipping firm. His wife Catherine, 38. Children: Emma, 14. Robert, 10. Thomas, 8. "Wait," Thomas said, pulling up another document. "There's a notation in institutional records. Catherine Harrison, admitted to Boston Lunatic Hospital in June 1889, days after this photograph." Sarah felt a chill. "Can we access those records?" "Not easily. Medical records from that period are restricted, but newspaper archives might help." The Boston Globe archives revealed fragments. A brief notice dated June 18, 1889. Commitment proceedings. Mrs. Catherine Harrison of South End, committed to Boston Lunatic Hospital following petition by husband. Witnesses testified to episodes of dangerous behavior. Children removed from household for safety. Sarah sat back, pieces forming a picture. He was protecting them. The photograph was taken right before he had her committed. Dr. Rebecca Stern's office at the Perkins School for the Blind overlooked a courtyard where students moved between classes. At 49, Rebecca had devoted her career to studying the history of tactile communication, particularly the informal systems families developed before standardized methods existed. Sarah spread the high-resolution images across Rebecca's desk. "I need your expertise on something that might be remarkable." Rebecca examined the photographs through a magnifying glass, her expression intensifying as she studied the father's hand position. "This is tactile signing," she said after several minutes. "Not formal, too idiosyncratic, but definitely intentional communication." She pulled out a reference book filled with historical illustrations of finger positions. In the 1880s, there was no single unified system for deaf education in America. Many families developed their own codes. These were usually modifications of finger spelling alphabets combined with agreed-upon gestures. "Can you interpret what he's saying?" Sarah asked. Rebecca positioned her own hand in the same arrangement as James Harrison's, feeling the position of each finger. It's difficult without knowing their specific system, but certain patterns appear across multiple families. The thumb and pinky pressed down while other fingers are positioned differently. That often indicated urgency or importance. The middle and ring fingers curved in this particular way. She paused, consulting references. In several documented systems, this configuration meant quiet or silent. Sarah felt her throat tighten. He's telling her to stay quiet. Possibly. Or to stay calm, to be safe. These hand positions often carried emotional weight beyond their literal meaning. A father touching his daughter this way while having their photograph taken. He's trying to comfort her while conveying a message. Rebecca looked up. What's the context? Sarah explained what she'd discovered about Catherine Harrison's commitment to the asylum, the sale of the house, the family's disappearance from Boston records. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally making notes. This photograph was taken 3 days before the commitment hearing, Sarah said. He would have known what was coming. Rebecca set down her magnifying glass. Then this wasn't just a family portrait. It was a farewell and a message. He was preparing his daughter for what was about to happen, telling her how to respond. Stay quiet, stay safe. Don't fight what's coming. They examined every detail through the lens of tactile communication. Rebecca pointed out how Emma's body language, standing close to her father, her own hand positioned as if ready to receive another message, suggested fluency in this silent language. The American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, maintained archives dating back to its founding in 1817. Sarah made the drive on a gray Saturday morning. The school's historian, Margaret Walsh, had agreed to search their records for any student named Emma Harrison. Margaret met Sarah in the archive room, a converted library smelling of old paper and preservation materials. We have enrollment records for every student who attended between 1817 and 1920, she explained, pulling out index cards organized by decade. They searched methodically. After 2 hours, Margaret found it. Harrison Emma, enrolled September 1889, age 14, origin Boston, Massachusetts. Father, James Harrison. Note, student arrived with significant emotional distress. Previous education, home taught. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the card. What else do the records show? Margaret pulled the corresponding student file, a thin folder containing intake forms and progress reports. The intake document, dated September 10, 1889, provided devastating details. Student is profoundly deaf following childhood fever. Has been educated at home by father using tactile communication method. Father reports recent family crisis necessitating placement. Student appears intelligent but withdrawn. The progress reports painted a picture of a traumatized girl slowly finding her footing. October 1889. Emma continues to struggle with transition, cries frequently. December 1889. Emma beginning to engage with lessons, shows particular aptitude for written English. March 1890. Emma has made 2 friends, smiles occasionally. Sarah read through 5 years of reports, watching Emma Harrison grow from a frightened 14-year-old into a young woman. By 1892, reports noted her excellence in academic subjects and her work helping younger deaf students. In 1894, at age 19, Emma graduated and took a position as an assistant teacher. This is remarkable, Margaret said. She not only survived her trauma, but used her experience to help others. The final document was a letter, written in Emma's own hand, addressed to the school's director in 1895. Dear Dr. Williams, I write to inform you that my father has passed away in Providence. He came to visit me last month and we had a long conversation, our hands speaking the language he taught me. He wanted me to know he never stopped thinking of my mother, that he prayed for her peace every day, and that he hoped I would forgive him for the choices he made to keep us safe. I told him there was nothing to forgive. He gave me the photograph taken of our family in 1889, the last picture before everything changed. When I look at it now, I can feel his hand on my shoulder again, telling me, stay quiet, stay safe, stay strong. Your grateful student, Emma Harrison. The Massachusetts State Archives held records from the Boston Lunatic Hospital. though accessing them required navigating layers of privacy restrictions. Sarah submitted formal research requests explaining her project's historical significance. 2 weeks later, she received permission to examine non-medical records, intake documents, legal petitions, and witness statements related to commitment proceedings. The reading room was quiet on a Wednesday morning. The file for Catherine Harrison was thin, many pages having been destroyed in a fire in the 1920s. But what remained told a devastating story. The commitment petition, filed by James Harrison on June 12, 1889, was written in careful legal language that couldn't mask the desperation behind it. My wife Catherine has suffered from episodes of violent mania for the past 3 years, growing progressively worse. She has attacked our children on multiple occasions. I fear for their safety and her own. I have exhausted all other remedies. Witness statements from neighbors painted a picture of a household in crisis. Mrs. Helen Bradford, who lived next door, testified, "I heard shouting and crashes several times per month. Once I saw Mrs. Harrison throw a plate at her daughter through the kitchen window. The child, the deaf one, she couldn't hear her mother coming and didn't know to run." Thomas Palmer, a family friend, provided more context. James Harrison is a good man trying to manage an impossible situation. His eldest daughter is deaf and cannot hear when her mother is having one of her episodes. More than once I've seen that child with bruises she couldn't explain because she didn't hear the danger approaching. The most haunting testimony came from Dr. Samuel Brooks, the family physician. "I have treated Mrs. Harrison for 3 years. Her condition has deteriorated markedly. She experiences periods of profound depression followed by episodes of violent agitation. She has expressed the belief that her daughter's deafness is divine punishment for some unspecified sin and has attempted to cure the child through violent means. The children, particularly young Emma, are at grave risk." Sarah closed her eyes against tears. Catherine Harrison hadn't been a monster. She'd been a woman suffering from what would now likely be diagnosed as bipolar disorder with psychotic features, living in an era when mental illness was barely understood and treatment options were limited to isolation and restraint. The intake record from the hospital noted Catherine's admission on June 18, 1889. Patient arrived in state of extreme agitation, required restraint, has been separated from children per court order. Prognosis, poor. The final record was dated March 1892. Patient Catherine Harrison deceased. Cause, pneumonia following prolonged confinement. Sarah returned to Rebecca Stern's office with all the documentation she'd gathered, the commitment records, Emma's school files, the family's scattered history. Together, they studied the photograph again, now understanding the full context of that frozen moment. "Look at it now," Rebecca said, knowing what was about to happen. Every detail takes on new meaning. Catherine Harrison sat with rigid posture, hands clenched in her lap. But her eyes, which Sarah had initially read as vacant, now seemed to be fighting for control. This was a woman in the grip of mental illness, holding herself together through sheer force of will for just long enough to sit for this photograph. "She knew," Sarah said softly. "She must have known what was coming." "Possibly," Rebecca agreed. Or perhaps this was one of her more lucid moments. The records mention she cycled between mania and depression. This could have been taken during a relatively stable period. The 2 young boys sat close to their mother but not touching her, a protective distance. Their faces showed the wariness of children who'd learned to read moods and anticipate danger. Robert, the older boy, had his hand gripped on the arm of his mother's chair, ready to steady it, or perhaps to push himself away quickly if needed. Rebecca positioned her own hand in the same configuration as James Harrison's again. "I've been studying historical tactile communication systems. I consulted with colleagues who specialize in 19th century deaf education. Based on documented finger spelling systems from that era and region, we can make an educated interpretation." She demonstrated slowly. The thumb pressed down typically indicated emphasis. The index finger extended often represented you. The middle and ring fingers curved this way. In several documented family systems, this meant quiet or silence. The pinky pressed firmly could indicate safe or safety. So he's telling her, "You, stay quiet, stay safe." Sarah said. That's my interpretation. And the pressure of his hand, visible even in the photograph, adds emotional weight. He's not just conveying information. He's trying to reassure her, to prepare her for what's coming without frightening her more than necessary. They looked at Emma's face again. The tension around her eyes made sense now. She was receiving her father's message, understanding what it meant, trying to stay composed for the photograph. Her body language, pressed close to her father, spoke of trust and fear in equal measure. Rebecca pulled out Emma's letter from Hartford. Listen to how she describes it. When I look at it now, I can feel his hand on my shoulder again, telling me the same thing he always told me. Stay quiet, stay safe, stay strong. She added, stay strong, Sarah noted. Yes, because that's what the message meant emotionally, beyond the literal words. Sarah spent the following weeks tracing what happened to the Harrison family after that photograph was taken. The story emerged in fragments, census records, city directories, school enrollment documents, each piece revealing how a single family fractured and tried to survive. James Harrison sold the family house on Tremont Street in August 1889, 2 months after Catherine's commitment. The property records showed he received far less than the house was worth, a desperate sale by a man who needed to relocate quickly. He moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where he found work as a bookkeeper at a textile mill. The two boys, Robert and Thomas, were harder to trace. Sarah found enrollment records showing they attended a boarding school in Worcester for a year, then seemed to disappear from Massachusetts records entirely. She eventually discovered them in Philadelphia census records from 1900, both working as clerks, living in separate boarding houses, no mention of family. They scattered, Rebecca said when Sarah shared her findings. It wasn't uncommon. Families dealing with mental illness and institutionalization often fractured completely. The stigma was enormous and people wanted to escape it. Emma's trajectory was clearest. After graduating from the American School for the Deaf, she worked there as an assistant teacher for 3 years, then moved to a similar position at a school in Pennsylvania. The 1900 census showed her living in Philadelphia, occupation listed as teacher of the deaf, boarding at a residential school. Sarah found something remarkable in the school's newsletter from 1898. An article written by Emma about teaching deaf children whose families had experienced trauma. She wrote, "These children need more than education in language and practical skills. They need to know that silence need not mean isolation, that what they have survived does not define what they can become." Through genealogical records, Sarah traced Emma's life further. She never married, but she remained at the Pennsylvania school for 23 years, eventually becoming head teacher. Former students remembered her decades later as strict but deeply caring, someone who understood what it meant to feel frightened and alone. James Harrison died in Providence in 1895, at age 48. The death certificate listed heart failure, but Sarah wondered if it wasn't just grief and exhaustion that killed him. He'd fought for years to protect his children from their mother's illness, made the agonizing decision to have Catherine committed, then watched his family dissolve despite his best efforts. Sarah found his obituary in the Providence Journal, a brief notice. James Harrison, bookkeeper, age 48, survived by 3 children. Services private. Catherine's grave was in the cemetery at the Boston Lunatic Hospital, in a section reserved for indigent patients. There was no headstone, just a plot number in the burial register. She'd died alone in that institution, separated from her children, her mind ravaged by an illness no one understood how to treat. Sarah arranged to meet Helen Richards again, this time bringing all the documentation she'd gathered. They met at a small cafe in Cambridge, and Sarah spread photocopies of records across the table. The commitment papers, Emma's school files, the census records showing the scattered family, the photograph that had started everything. Helen examined each document carefully, her expression shifting between sadness and recognition. "It makes sense now," she said finally. "My grandmother, Emma's daughter, she was also a teacher of deaf children. I never understood why she was so passionate about it, why she always said that every child deserved to feel safe and understood. This is why." "Emma had a daughter?" Sarah asked, surprised. The records she'd found showed Emma never married. She adopted a deaf girl in 1905, Helen explained. There's not much documentation. Adoption was informal then, but family stories say Emma took in a child whose mother couldn't care for her. Raised her, educated her, gave her the childhood Emma herself had lost. The pattern continued through generations. Helen's mother had worked with deaf children too, though by then the field had changed dramatically. It became a family legacy, Helen said, helping deaf children, especially those from difficult circumstances. Now I understand where it started, with Emma and her father, and a language only they could speak. Sarah showed Helen the analysis Rebecca had done of the hand position in the photograph. Your great-great-grandfather was telling Emma to stay quiet, stay safe. He was preparing her for what was coming, her mother's removal, the family's separation, everything that was about to change. And she kept that photograph her entire life, Helen said, touching the image gently. Kept the message her father gave her and passed it on, in her own way, to every frightened child she taught. They talked for hours, filling in gaps with family stories Helen remembered. Her grandmother had spoken occasionally about being raised by Emma, about learning that silence could be a form of communication as powerful as speech, that safety sometimes meant difficult choices, that love persisted even through tragedy. Emma never talked about her mother, Helen said. My grandmother said the one time she asked about Emma's parents, Emma told her simply, my father was a good man who did the best he could. My mother was sick and couldn't help herself. Both deserved to be remembered with compassion. Sarah felt tears welling again. After everything, the violence, the trauma, the family's destruction, Emma had found a way to hold both truths, her mother's illness and her father's impossible choices, the pain she'd endured and the strength she'd found. What will you do with this research? Helen asked. I want to tell their story, Sarah said. Not sensationalize it, but honor what they survived. The photograph isn't just a historical artifact. It's evidence of how people communicated, protected each other, and endured impossible circumstances. Helen nodded. Emma would approve. She always believed that understanding the past helped us do better in the present. 3 months later, Sarah completed her restoration of the photograph. The image had been cleaned, stabilized, and documented with all the historical context she'd uncovered. She prepared an exhibition at the Conservation Lab titled Silent Messages, Communication and Survival in Victorian Boston. The exhibition displayed the Harrison family photograph alongside Sarah's research, explaining tactile communication systems, the realities of mental illness in the 19th century, and how families like the Harrisons navigated impossible choices with limited resources and crushing stigma. Rebecca contributed a section on deaf education history, showing how families developed their own communication systems and how those informal methods eventually influenced formal deaf education. Margaret from Hartford provided Emma's school records, showing her transformation from traumatized child to accomplished teacher. The exhibition opened on a cold January evening. Helen attended with her daughter, Emma's great-great-granddaughter, a speech therapist who worked with deaf children. 3 generations stood before that photograph, understanding now what it truly represented. Media coverage was modest but meaningful. The Boston Globe ran a feature about the exhibition, emphasizing how Sarah's careful investigation had revealed a family's hidden story. Several deaf community organizations reached out, interested in the tactile communication system James Harrison had developed with his daughter. But the most touching response came from visitors who saw their own family struggles reflected in the Harrisons' story. People dealing with mental illness, families making difficult choices to protect children, individuals who'd survived trauma and built meaningful lives afterward. One visitor, an elderly woman, stood before the photograph for nearly an hour. Finally, she approached Sarah. My grandfather was deaf, she said. My great-grandmother developed her own way of talking to him, touching his hands in patterns. We thought it was just something she'd invented, but maybe it was more common than we knew. Maybe there are more families like this, stories we haven't uncovered yet. Sarah realized she was right. The Harrison family photograph had survived by chance, and only because Sarah had recognized something unusual in that hand position. How many other photographs held similar secrets? How many families had developed their own languages, made their own impossible choices, and left behind evidence that no one had yet learned to read. She thought about James Harrison standing in that studio in 1889, positioning his hand carefully on his daughter's shoulder, making sure the photographer captured that specific moment. He couldn't have known that more than a century later, someone would finally understand what he'd been saying. But perhaps he'd hoped. Perhaps that's why he'd insisted on no retouching, on capturing the image exactly as it was, because he wanted the truth preserved, even if it took generations for someone to see it. The photograph now sat in a climate-controlled case, properly preserved and contextualized. But its real preservation was in understanding, knowing that behind that formal Victorian composition was a father telling his deaf daughter that despite everything about to happen, she should stay quiet, stay safe, and find a way to stay strong. And she had. Emma Harrison had taken that message and built a life that honored it, helping other frightened children find their own strength, their own ways to communicate, their own paths through trauma to survival. The exhibition would close eventually. The photograph would return to Helen's family, but the story would persist. That was the real legacy. Not the image itself, but what it taught about resilience, communication, and the lengths people go to protect those they love, even when every choice feels impossible. Sarah stood in the quiet gallery after everyone had left, looking one last time at the Harrison family frozen in that moment before everything changed. 5 people bound by blood and circumstance, each carrying their own private pain, together for one final photograph. And in that moment, captured forever, a father's hand speaking a language of love and protection that had waited 135 years to be understood.